So the topic of the second part is Mount Athos. Mount Athos, to start with, for many people it's an ideology. From some others, at least, is a place. But for those who understand what is Mount Athos, is neither an ideology, neither a place, but neither a place, but it is a way of life. And that way of life, when you learn it and when you appreciate it, you wanted to live it, no matter what. You wanted to repeat all the good parts or the good lessons that you learned through this. Definitely is not a geography. Is not only a particular geographical place in Greece. Happens to be at the same time a particular place who is quite lengthy, in other words, close to 40 to 50 kilometers, and 10 to 15 kilometers on the other side, but is a quite big peninsula that is a particular geography, it's a particular nature, it's a particular many other things. But for those who really visit it in a spiritual way, they will find that, especially those who are Orthodox, they will find that Mount Athos is the Holy of Holies. In other words, it is the most sacred place that we have on earth to understand the different way of life. The different way of life that the people lead there, it's not only for them, but it's for the entire world. In other words, their contribution to the entire world is that constant prayer that it's unending. Then in Mount Athos, there is no a single hour during the day that there is no particular services that takes place somewhere in Mount Athos. And that, at the end, because it's transformed into beauty, and as Dostoevsky said that beauty will save the world, so we are saved because of that. And to my personal understanding is that I feel an incredible responsibility that from my youth happens that my parents and my relatives and my friends and colleagues, they introduce me to that world, to that geography, but at the same time to that kind of spirituality. And I consider it one of the biggest blessings in my life. That's why also I'm insisting on talking about Mount Athos, talking about what that means for the modern society, for the modern men, for the Orthodox tradition in general. And because in these particular circumstances, the circumstances of the 1,000-year history of Mount Athos, the identification is that beauty happens to be associated with silence. And that kind of combination is very unique because we try in our societies, in our developments, to discuss different topics, to discuss different items among ourselves with our common language. But there are something which is beyond words and beyond language and beyond even understanding, which is associated with the deeper understanding of Mount Athos. So, to me, in a simple way, and because we just saw these last 2 weeks the Olympic Games and in Paris, And we saw also that one of the springs that happened there is the change of the baton. You have sprinters that the one next to the other gets the baton from the previous one and gives it to the next. To us, Orthodox Christians, this is tradition. Tradition is nothing else than to get the baton from somebody and give it to somebody else, or pass it to somebody else. Only for those who want it, of course, not those who don't want it. Those who wanted really to participate in that kind of athleticism, if you like. So the history of Mount Athos is 1,000 years and more. In 1963, we celebrate the 1,000 years from the time of 963, where the first monks established the first monastic communities in Mount Athos. From these 1,000 years, we have stories and stories to tell about the developments and the changes that happens during this historical big period. But here I will concentrate a little bit more particularly on the last part, on the last decades, and showing that, from the 1900s, let's say, the amount of monks in Mount Athos had been 4,000 to 5,000. Why? Because it was before the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. There was a very huge influx of monks of Russian descent that has been established themselves in the Russian monastery of Mount Athos, which is called St. Panteleimon. There have been over 2,000 monks that came from Russia. But because of different particular political circumstances and political differences, there have been some splits in the 1900s, and some of them left and went back to Russia. And in any case, they left the peninsula of Mount Athos. Then the numbers from the 1900s and on till the 1950s or 60s have been diminishing constantly. They say that the maximum number of monks in the previous centuries have been close to 20,000 monks. At that time, in the 1930s and 40s, especially after the Second War, and in the 50s, the number of monks have been diminished to 1,100 almost. And everybody around was talking about that this kind of society, that this kind of environment that was held there for 1,000 years, perhaps will collapse, which eventually everything could become like a museum. Some of the monasteries, they left with very few monks, and it was difficult to recruit new monks at that time. Now, in 1963, they make a decision to make a big celebration of 1,000 years of history of Mount Athos. And all kinds of celebrities, including kings and emperors and so on, they have been invited to the ceremonies. Some roads have been constructed, although they have not been roads available before, for the particular festivities. But at the same time, all kinds of articles on newspapers, on magazines, they are talking about the celebrations of the 1,000 years, but at the same time, they are worried that the entire place will become a big museum. And that was the worry of most of the people around, using all the common senses and the numbers and the algebra that, identification of numbers and circumstances. But nobody at that time could believe that that kind of change can happen in this kind of circumstances. But the reality is, and still it was and still is, that the protector of the mountain is the Virgin Mary, is not simple ideologies or practices or particular people. So we saw an incredible change that happened after the 1963. A lot of young communities and brotherhoods of people from all over the Greece, people that they finish universities, they have very good studies and studies abroad. They rediscover what was the value of Mount Athos, and they wanted to join the old and traditional monasteries there. So a lot of brotherhoods from different places of Greece eventually end up being established in Mount Athos, and then they create a new atmosphere which helps the revival of many communities. At the same time, the situation, the political situation, and I will say the theological situation in Greece changed drastically. From the time of the 30s and 40s and 50s, where we have the big Christian movements that have been influenced Greece, especially as copies of Western influences from the Roman Catholics and from the Protestants, and they infiltrate for a number of years and decades Greece. Now there is a big turn towards patristic theology, towards the liturgy, towards the fathers of the church, towards the Eucharist. And that kind of climate gave birth to a new reality, the re-establishment of very young communities and brotherhoods in the different monasteries, an incredible renewal that happened into the one after the other monasteries. Although in the previous years, in the previous decades, we saw that a lot of monasteries became ideorhythmic, what we call it. In other words, each one was living by himself, and only the church was common for everybody. Now, one by one, the older monasteries became again synobitic. In other words, common trapeza, common services, common responsibilities, and so on. And eventually, during the next decades, all the monasteries who have been ideorhythmic has been changed into the synobitic, which means that at the end, there is no way back now. If a monastery is synobitic, can never become ideorhythmic again. That, at the same time, created the emphasis on the renewal of the life in Mount Athos, who has as a consequence the change of the life in Greece. Due to all kinds of different circumstances. One was the movement of Kolivades. Kolivades was a movement in Mount Athos which they decided to protest the celebration of memorial services during Sundays. They say Sunday is the day of the Lord, is the day of the resurrection. If we have to have memorial service, we have to do it on Saturdays. But on Saturdays, there is not a lot of commerce. There's a lot of festivities and so on, so much less people. So that was against their commercial values. So the big fight came between the people who are with the Kolivades and the people who were against them. And eventually the people who were against were much more than the ones who are in favor of Kolivades. And they decided at the end to throw them out of Mount Athos. Throw them out, hundreds of them, who have been the traditional Kolivades. They thought that they will clean Mount Athos from that kind of old ideologies. But what happened at the end is that they gave birth to all kinds of new communities in all over the different islands of Greece. So in every island there was one brotherhood that went there and changed the life of the island. And we saw these kind of changes in every place that Kolivades went. So as a result was the rediscovery of the patristic theology by the people on the islands and then eventually by the people in the capital cities, and the renewal of Mount Athos at the same time. That has as an effect the presence of big spiritual fathers, that we did not have that before the Second War. And these big spiritual fathers have been simple monks for many of them, like Father Porphyrios and Father Paisios and Father Dionysius and Father Theocritus and a few of the others, the one after the other. But many of them became the abbots of the new monasteries, like the Abbot George of Grigoriou Monastery, the Abbot Haralambos of Dionysio, the Abbot Ephrem of Philotheo, and so on. And that contributed to the incredible renewal not only on Mount Athos, but on the entire Greece and eventually all the Balkans, and then has an effect even into the Russia and Ukraine. So that was the time to visit Mount Athos, and that was the time that I was old enough, young enough at the same time, to make my first visit to Mount Athos. And the last one was last year, who was the 63rd of my visits. And I hope that till the end of my life I will continue to going there as a simple pilgrim, figure out most of the times, the new people, the new ideas, the new circumstances that they exist. Now, more and more and more, this kind of spiritual atmosphere that has been created to the big monasteries has been transferred to the cities, has been transferred to the small parts of Greece, in the Balkans, in Serbia, in Bulgaria, in Asia Minor even, and so on. And the effect of that kind of the new understanding of Orthodox spirituality is spreading more and more and more. I am glad that I see that kind of spread even in North America. Even what happened with the extension of the monasteries that Father Ephrem did, so many in the States, in Canada, the renewal of monastic life among the Orthodox in Canada, in the US, in England, in Australia, and so on. And definitely that will have a lot of consequences for these new Orthodox lands all over the place. So Mount Athos is not a place. It's a way of life that you can carry it and you can bring it. You can it to every part of the world. Recently, I saw a beautiful, beautiful film about the Orthodox Church in Alaska. By seeing these old faces, these old houses, these old people that they believe in Herman of Alaska, that they follow the tradition, I felt that that's the Mount Athos of the North. The same thing happened in Siberia. The same thing happened in the northern part of Europe. The same thing happened in Australia. So this way of life changes societies, changes people's minds, changes understandings. And that's why the message of Mount Athos has to be spread all over into the small of our communities, into our churches, into our associations, into our understanding, into in our way of life.